Now, it's time for the Anchormen podcast with Matt Gaetz and Dan Ball.
We were joined today by Florida Congresswoman Ana Paulina Luna. And Ana, if I'm not your biggest fan, I'm definitely like at the upper tier of the fan club. I am at least on the board of the fan club. And when I tell people about your background, a lot of people don't know that you were in the military. I was just wondering if you could take us back to the moment when you decided to join the military. Why did you do it? What was in your mind? And now, as a mother, a congresswoman, looking back, how did it impact your life?
Yeah, so I really wanted to go to school, and I had absolutely no way of paying for it. And ultimately, my dad was struggling at the time with substance abuse and wasn't really in the picture. And my mom had 2 younger kids from another marriage. And so for me, I needed a avenue of really getting out of a bad situation.
Sounds like chaos.
Yeah, looking back at it, I actually didn't think that my life was abnormal. And I mean, the rest of my bio, but it wasn't until I joined the military and I was like, maybe it wasn't the best circumstances. But I ended up actually being at an event, and I overheard 2 young guys talking about the GI Bill and how they're going to be starting school. And they were like 20 years old. Anyways, they ended up being Marines at Camp Pendleton. And I asked what they did. They told me. And so I actually map quested. So this is going to date me a little bit. But I map quested. I printed directions. And I drove to a recruiter's office. And the Air Force recruiter was there. And that's how I joined the Air Force.
Did you choose the Air Force for a particular reason, or that was just the office you went into?
It was the one where the recruiter was there. I actually had initially went to look at the Marine Corps.
And when you went through basic training and your initial military training, did you ever imagine you would be a United States Congresswoman?
No, in fact, well, first of all, when I told my parents that I had enlisted, remember this is the tail end of 2000 or early 2009, so we had just kicked off the global war on terror, and ultimately my mom thought I was going to literally die, and so she freaked out. I told her my ship out date, and then my dad was actually pretty shocked too. So I didn't really tell my parents what I was doing. They ended up being fully supportive of it. And then obviously in our immediate family, my dad hadn't served, my mom hadn't served. And so it was really different for us. But no, I never had anticipated on actually going into politics. And so that story is a little interesting in itself.
We'll get there. I'm not done with the military.
Yeah.
So set the scene for the year, like when your years where you're doing the military service.
Yeah, so I was 19 years old when I enlisted, which looking back at it, I was a kid. I was right out of high school. And
This is post 9/11?
Yeah, post 9/11. It was in 2009, February 2009, I enlisted. And I went to...
At that time, had the people's opinion soured on the war that were in the military?
No, I think that in general sentiment was still pretty high.
Yeah, okay.
And especially for me, I mean, I didn't have any family that was super into politics the way that I'm into politics now. And so for me, I was looking at it more of a way of serving and then also to helping my family. So actually the entire time that I was in, I was actually able to send money back home. And so I went from being, basically an LA kid, city urban population, to essentially getting stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and really kind of seeing what the rest of the country had to offer. And I'd say, a lot of people say, well, is it because you joined the military that you ended up being so conservative? I would actually say I've experienced every single liberal policy possible and lived to tell the tale that they don't work. And so because of that, I was actually able to use my platform to help encourage other people to just think for themselves and really fight for the American dream.
Would you encourage young people today to consider military service?
1,000%. And I still do. Actually, I've encouraged all of my staff to join. And then also, too, when I hear stories, I think one of the most frustrating things for me is that you'll have people that say that the military, I've heard people, especially members of Congress, say that the military unfairly recruits minority demographics. When I joined the military, it was an opportunity for me to actually excel at life. It gave me the structure that I needed. It paid for my college. It stepped in and really provided structure that I desperately needed. And so for people like me, it's an opportunity where you can actually make something of yourself and have a hell of a career, to be honest with you.
You served in a dual role as a military veteran, but then also as a military spouse. Your husband, terrific man. How did that type of service differ from putting on the uniform yourself?
So again, I got married very early. I joined the military. I did not anticipate on finding a husband. I got married at 20 years old. Andy was 21. So literally had only been in the service a couple of months, and told, again, my mom we were getting married after knowing him for a month. And my mom thought I was crazy. And here we are 15 years later. And it wasn't always easy, right? Because when you're that young and then you see the ops tempo, the deployment cycle, my husband Andy had a job that was very different from a lot of your regular military. And he had a job that took him away every 6 months to deploy to a combative and kinetic location. So Andy was at Air Force Combat Control. You know this. You knew where Hurlburt Field was, which is where we were stationed. By the way, Matt, I have told you this before, but for those who don't know, you are literally the first member of Congress that I voted for. So pretty cool, full circle. But, for us especially, it gives you a lens and perspective of what military families go through. And by the time Andy and I had left active duty service, many of our friends had been married and divorced multiple times because of PTSD, because of the stressors that the military put on the family. So when I came and I brought that perspective to Washington, it's a different lens that you look at, especially when you hear a lot of people advocating for war.
Yeah, I remember when the military family issues were things like, we want nice housing, we want
No
good
mold.
commissary benefits, no mold. But now, really, childcare has been the issue that has roared for military families who feel like that ought to be part of their entitlement. And it's been really challenging, I think, industry-wide there. Like if you could wave a magic wand and do anything to help military families, what would it be?
The first thing I would do is get rid of the contractors that hold the contracts currently for base housing, because what we're finding is actually speaking to the mold issue, that many of them receive massive government contracts and then they will literally paint over black mold. I mean, they don't do anything to actually cleanse these facilities or housing locations before these families move in, and then it subjects these military families to long-term mold exposure that can actually be deadly in some cases. So that's the first thing I would do. But the second thing in regards to childcare, I mean, anything that you can do to actually make it easier. A lot of family members that are maybe, 4, sometimes 5 kids on an E1, 2, or E3 salary, which, you can look that up. It's not a lot of money, but sometimes they are on SNAP and EBT benefits. And I think that's crazy that our military members are using SNAP and EBT in order to pay at the commissary. And so I think that goes to speak to, you have defense contractors making millions of dollars. You have these people that are getting paid essentially nothing and then being forced to use these, programs that aren't necessarily great. So.
In Congress, in the Gen X and Boomer generations, the veterans were almost exclusively, I would say, very pro-war. They had a foreign policy view, particularly on the Republican side, that would more mirror Liz Cheney than Donald Trump. It would be more John Bolton, less J.D. Vance. And your generation, our generation of veterans, you're a veteran, I'm not, seem to have a lot more skepticism about foreign entanglement and foreign involvement. What do you attribute that to?
I think that the generation that I'm in and that our generation fought, the war was different, right? So you had the war in Afghanistan, the war on, all of that, the war on terror. You have multiple ops tempos and deployment cycles. It's different than Vietnam, World War I, World War II, even Korea, where people would go and then they would maybe spend some time there and then not have to go back. As a result of that, you're also seeing many of the younger members of Congress actually look to alternative therapies for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think that that's also something that needs to be taken seriously, because PTSD, when you're in the military, you hear about it. And a lot of us younger, you're invincible, did not fully understand the long-term implications and impacts of that until you get out and then you see what your friends or your loved ones are struggling with after the fact. So I'd say it's because the war was different. Then also, too, it's and that, from a member of Congress perspective pisses me off, because you'll have these same people that advocate for war. They don't have people that are draft age that are going to be serving that are in their family. If they were in the military and they are advocating for war, we'll look at all who they're taking money from, the defense contractors. And to me, it's disingenuous, because you're willing to send young men, very smart, brilliant young men and women, to the front lines to basically seal the deal for something that you have no business interfering with in the first place. And so, speaking to President Trump's foreign policy perspective, that Rubio, who we love, has been doing a great job implementing that policy. And then also you hear J.D. Vance, who was a devil dog Marine. He brings a unique perspective to this as well, because he's not your average run-of-the-mill vet up in Washington that's advocating for war. And I think...
Where do you worry about war most on the planet Earth
right now? Ukraine and Russia, and actually was just in Foreign Affairs earlier today, and you should probably look at the clip for that. because I actually was able to ask the witness that we had about what he thought with Lindsey Graham and the other senator heading out to Ukraine. And I think that when you have people, again, advocating for war, undermining the White House and Secretary of State's position on what's currently happening, undermining peace talks, and then they're literally actively getting paid by some of these defense contractors, that's corrupt.
You think that's what's happening with Lindsey Graham?
Yeah, I think that's, and you know, Lindsey Graham is a vet, but I think it's disingenuous what he's doing. I think it's dangerous too. You know, Ukraine, NATO, they chose to not join. NATO is actively, especially some of the European countries, specifically Germany, that's facing an economic crisis right now, is advocating for Ukraine to get kinetic with Russia. And as a result of that, you're seeing them undermine President Trump's foreign policy perspective. But by the way, we're paying a majority of NATO's fair share. So if they want to do that, if they want to engage in war, then we don't need to be funding it. And I continuously push for the withdrawal of NATO and defunding because of that perspective.
I think we should expand NATO. I just think it's worth looking at the wrong country. I think we should invite Russia into NATO. Like if NATO is going to have a modern purpose, it would be to position as an alliance of the United States and Russia and aligned entities against China, against extremism. And it would probably result in a lot more peace if we were more closely cooperating with Russia in areas where we had common interests.
Well, I don't think that Russia is fully aligned with China. I think that they've just been pushed into that friendship for now.
Well, it's a leveraged buyout.
Exactly. But what I would also like to say is that it's really sad that we can't even have that discussion, because if you do, then you're labeled a Russia sympathizer, when in actuality right now, no one's talking about, I'm very surprised that aside from Kash Patel's post on X, talking about basically a bioweapon that China basically sent to the United States, smuggled in, and they caught them. Why that's not getting more traction? You have.
Do you think that was an act of war?
I would declare it as that, because of the fact that it could make people sick, it could destroy our crops. And by the way, remember, China has a social credit system. Nothing goes in or out with them without them knowing about that. So you can't say it's plausible deniability on that.
Well, I think that actually is what they were trying to achieve. I think that what is like insidious about agro-tourism, a phrase I hadn't even thought about until we had this experience, is that you're creating so much mass famine and
it can make
ailment.
you sick, yeah.
Yeah, and you're not, the perpetrator doesn't have to be really proximate to it at the time, unlike a bomb, unlike something else that we would normally align with terrorism. And so, like, are we going to have competing warring funguses? Are we going to have to send our funguses to China to take out their crops as a deterrent?
I think it actually brings up a scary discussion. So remember that there was all of these DNA companies that had data breaches and leaks. I think that we're entering an age, especially with scientific development, where you can actually have specified targeted bioagents that do attack people's genomes, whether or not they engineered this to do that. But I think it is alarming, and I think the fact that you have people that were, as Trump says, panicans on the whole tariff issue, not actually understanding that China really does have a chokehold on us. And then essentially what they did with this bioweapon, which is what it is basically try to make everyone in the country sick and kill all of our crops. I mean...
Do you think it was a response to the trade war?
I do, absolutely. I think that was the same thing that happened with Wuhan.
Oh, you think that you can tie both of those biological attacks to Trump's choices on trade?
Yes.
Because right before the Wuhan flu, Trump was working toward a deal with the Chinese. You think that they preferred chaos to that deal,
Correct.
but
and
they
I don't
were
think
too
that they're
far
stupid.
in.
I think that they're really smart. I actually was at the White House when they first announced that COVID-19 was a pandemic, and I remember the conversation that took place. I was actually in the Eisenhower building. And what I will tell you is that China's not stupid. They know that they can't probably hit us head on in a kinetic war, and so that it's going to have to be behind the scenes. I don't think, and it's like kind of funny because especially being in politics, half of the time I'll see, and you can always tell if there's bot farms, bot trends, trying to sway public sentiment on certain things. And I see it from time to time on certain issues, but I do think right now that China would like nothing more than for there to be a kinetic incident with Russia. I think, again, tying back to foreign policy, what happened with Lindsey Graham going over there, I actually was talking with AI, and it actually went through and just completely demolished and destroyed their whole policy on sanctioning Russia, because they're like, this is literally political theater because you actually don't have something serious that would be binding to Russia.
You were talking to AI?
Yeah, I was going back and forth with Grok on the whole topic.
Do you do that a lot?
Yeah.
Like every day you talk to the robot?
No, but when I have political discussions going through sometimes even policy, I talk to AI about it.
Do you think other congressmen talk to robots?
I would say that there's probably only 2 others that actually do it, but it's kind of funny because especially on the legislation, look, I ran through the rules manual, I read it, but people will come up with these bullshit answers and then I'll run it through, I'll have my opinion, run it through, and then I'll check it and then I go back and
They say, if it's not the robots that takes over, it's going to be the people who know how to use the robots. So I guess you're talking to them. So I want to get back to your entry to Congress, because when I think about where did Anna Paulina Luna come from, you did not run for local office. You did not come from
pedigree family.
The scion of some family that had the ability to provide great resources, as mine did. Is it unfair to say you were kind of the first influencer turned congresswoman?
Yeah, I think that's actually what freaks people out, and that's when Time Magazine kind of did that profile. I actually had a very big social media following because of my work in my past life, obviously.
So you don't reject that label?
No.
Okay. Is there any other? Because I was picking my brain today, and I was like, is there a single other person that meets the Luna category of influencer turned member of Congress?
No, and I think that it's actually interesting because when I first ran, part of the reason why I was able to compete with big money from Washington, so after you endorsed me, there was, for those people watching, there was a candidate in the race that was actually being fully backed by the party actually against me.
By Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah, by Kevin McCarthy. And a lot of PAC money was coming in against me to the tune of millions. The only way I was able to combat that, and this was before the whole influencer fundraising market was saturated, is I actually digitally fundraised. And I was able to put my link on my WinRed link online, and people were giving me $10, $5, $20, and actually was responsible for me being able to compete and then secure my nomination into Washington.
Yeah. So you are one of one in this category.
Correct.
But so many run. So many influencers run. And I don't know if they run to win, and you were clearly running to win, or if they're running just to build their brand. But I bet a lot would love your yellow brick road strategy. So you talk about these small dollar resources. How did you list build to be able to get there? And then talk a little bit about the guerrilla advertising you would do, because you would send messages out at a very low cost, but they were raw, authentic, entertaining, cool. Go ahead and give us a little look in the Luna playbook.
Yeah, so when I first ran for office, I was obviously digitally fundraising heavily, and then COVID happened. And so I was able to, again, I think it was perfect timing in the sense that people were just paying attention to what was happening online. But
how much money are we talking here?
I'm talking my first race, I raised $3 million, and that was small dollar donations. Yeah, and so a lot of people kind of wonder, how can we replicate it now? I think now it's a little bit saturated, but the point is going back to what really won my election. So people ask, okay, so what do you do? How do you get data? And really talking about lists. Lists are the email contacts, all of that, to where you actually are able to engage a small dollar donor. And it actually started with just WinRed collecting the information. I don't know if you know this, but I actually fired my first general consultant because they were stealing money from me. And I found that out.
That happens
early.
to so many candidates.
And it happens, and sometimes they'll just run candidates to steal the money, not actually.
They're just a parasite that needs a host, and they don't care if the host dies, they'll move on to
Exactly,
another.
and that happens, unfortunately, to a lot of good candidates in politics. But I always tell people, you can be the best candidate in the world, but if you can't fundraise to get your name out there to basically advertise the brand, then it doesn't matter how good you are.
But I don't want to give people false hope in this, because there are a lot of people who will watch this and say, oh, perfect. Small dollar donors. I'll send out some emails, send out some text messages, and just like Anna Paulina Luna, I will have $3 million at my disposal.
No.
When the reality is, a lot of people would be better served if they can only raise maybe $100,000 or $200,000, run for the city council, the county board of supervisors.
Mayor.
Yeah, mayor, maybe a state legislative position. So, was it your experience with digital marketing? Was it some of the messaging you leaned into?
I think it was the messaging in part, and then also too, I did a lot of the hard work that other people didn't want to do. So I actually started doing something called cold calling, where you will get donor lists of random people and you will physically call them. Total strangers. You physically call them.
Hello, it's nice to meet you.
Yes.
I would like $5,500 of your dollars.
Yes, and you actually have to pitch yourself in a minute to this person and basically try to convince them to donate.
What's the success rate on that?
It's not high. And I've had a lot of people say no. And I had a lot of people because
I'm guessing you haven't been rejected a lot in life. So what was that?
I always tell people I've never really had to ask people for money, and I hate it to this day. I hate making phone calls, but I do it because, again, I'm not really.
You still do that? You still cold call people?
I do about 3 hours a week.
What do people mostly say when? I mean, now you're a very.
Sometimes they'll call me and say, like, thank you so much for actually doing. I'm so sick and tired of the bullshit I'm seeing in Washington. Like, you're one of the good ones. Stay the course. Please don't quit anytime soon. We need you. And then I'll start laughing because I.
Do any think it's not really you? That it's like a robot?
No, sometimes my smaller dollar people, like if they've donated, $100, $200, I'll actually call them and say thank you. Sometimes they'll think that it's not actually me, and they'll say, wait, is this actually you? And then I say yes, and they'll be like, honey, come here, she's on the phone. It's kind of sweet. But I will say that you have to stay humble. You have to be willing to do the hard work. And then between last election and this election, even though I'm already in, I've knocked over 60,000 doors with my campaign manager, Olivia, and then my district director, Sam Wilson, and then a couple of other volunteers, and made over 110,000 phone calls. And so I actually have the biggest...
Do you think you would have won without the doors and the phone calls?
I have the biggest grassroots operation in Congress in the country, period. I will take that to the bank because that's literally just me and my small team.
What do you attribute that to?
Hard work, not wanting to lose. I hate losing. And then also to just understanding that if I'm actually going to put my family out there, put my name out there, that I want to actually bring home wins. And I do think that, yes, we have a lot wrong here, but I do think that we can do a lot of good. And so there's a younger generation of people, the next generation coming up is extremely conservative. And so they need good leaders to look to. And so I'm hoping that, I think it was Denzel Washington that said, for each one, teach one. And so that's what I'm hoping to do.
You were my one. So
I will say you actually were the only member of Congress that would talk to me when I first ran. And then I had that crazy nut job that you just did the story on. But I actually attribute my success largely to you helping to fight off some of the attacks that I was getting. So thank you.
Well, here's what I knew about you, that you would be genuine and sincere. And I am so just frustrated with how people present one way to their voters, but then they come here and they're just shills for their donors. And like when you're cold calling someone, you're not establishing some sort of obligation to them, right?
Yeah.
Because the very nature of it is not like, oh, we're going to go on some junket together. We're going to, and by the way, they do. We see how many in Congress have that type of relationship with their lobbyists and special interest donors. And I knew you wouldn't do that. And maybe you'd get some things right or wrong, but at least it would be the stuff you believed. And now you are this one of one in Congress. And I wonder, from your perspective, do you think you are just an anomaly, a one-off, or is this the front end of the wave? And are we going to see more people who have central to their identity a digital following, activate that following to the type of grassroots deliverables that gave you election victories?
I think that it can be replicated, and I hope to replicate it. I have seen already a shift, I think, in the last Congress that came in of people that are more conservative leaning, that already kind of have profiles, if you will, but understand that Congress, as much as it's national, it's still very much local. And so you can't just fully rely and phone it in, as they say.
But they're local influencers, right?
Yeah.
Even in communities. Well,
that's what I'm saying is, like, if you have a good network in your community, I would say absolutely try to leverage that and then try to run. Because what we're finding is, like, young people, especially like our age people, don't want to typically get involved in politics because it can be nasty. But like, if that's one thing that we need, it's younger people, because there's so much fatigue and this job is not easy. And so you have to have people that have the bandwidth and the stamina to take on some of these issues, because if we don't, we're going to continue to see the same things happening over and over again. And honestly, I think sometimes people that are, later in life don't really have a lot to live for. So if they're voting for things like massive debt, it doesn't really impact them the way that it does for us, because they're, closer to the end of life.
Yeah. Should there be like an age limit on Congress?
After AutoPenGate, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. So someone was engaged in a murder plot to kill you. And when people hear that, they will...
It sounds wild.
Yeah, they will think that is crazy. And when I remember reading the headlines that you were accusing the opposition in your campaign of literally conspiring to kill you. And I thought, what in the world? Has Anna heard a rumor and said it to a reporter? I called you and I said, Anna, people are going to think that you've lost your mind making this type of an allegation. And you just told me to remain calm, that all the evidence would come forward, and then it did.
If the poll says Luna's going to win, she's going to be gone. She's going to disappear. She's a stupid, excuse my language, social media influencer.
Yeah.
There's no reason she should be in office.
Let's just say that, Luna's going to win.
She won't. And if we have polling that proves she won't, she's going to be gone, period. That's end of discussion. Luna's not an issue.
How do we make her go?
I call up my Russian and Ukrainian hit squad, and within 24 hours, they're sending me pictures of her disappearing. Close battle, combat, Tech 9s, Mac 10s, silencers kind of thing. No snipers.
No.
Up close and personal, so they know the person. They know that the target is gone. Don't be on the wrong side of supporting Luna.
Yeah.
Because if you're near her when time comes, I just don't want that to happen to you when you've got kids. I'm not just blowing smoke here. I'm being dead-ass serious, and it scares the me too.
So when did you know people were trying to kill you?
I got a call very late in the night, and at first I thought it wasn't true, and then I heard the recording, and what I can say about that is that, politics obviously is super crazy, but with that being said, there's also really crazy people in the world that might actually do crazy stuff like that. And it didn't just stop there. This person ended up fleeing the country, and the U.S. Marshals got involved, the DOJ, the FBI, and ultimately...
If this had not been foiled, do you think there would have really been an attempt on your life?
Based on the fact that the person was stalking me, yeah, I think so. And what's crazy to me is that the leftist media tried to paint me like I was nuts and that I was losing it. I actually tried to get a restraining order against this person. If I was anyone else, if I was not running for office, if I was not conservative, I probably would have gotten it. What's interesting is I actually later on kind of went after the judge a little bit because she did not end up giving me the restraining order. The guy fled the country. Then his opponent was recruited to run against me, or his attorney was recruited to run against me, which is also really crazy, and was backed by the former speaker, which was also nuts. But anyways, McCarthy,
not Paul Ryan.
Not Paul Ryan. But the point is that that person, they were talking about having me shot at close range proximity. They were telling people where they knew where I lived. I think that this
Did you ever think about now running when you heard that recording?
Well, I was already running at the time.
Yeah, did you ever think about just stopping?
No, because I felt like if I gave up, I was going to give them what they wanted, which was for me to not be running for office, but also too...
How did your family react to that?
I mean, my mom was like, you need to... not be in politics. And my
mom would have been like, you are not doing this anymore.
Yeah, at the time my dad was still alive, and my dad was obviously he was pissed. Andy was obviously really concerned, and as part of the stipulation for me running and now being in office is I have to have security. So
Well, and I wanted to talk about that as well because I remember feeling like you always had to be aware and alert in public.
I still am,
And it is an edge that you have to maintain at all times that I don't think our predecessors really had to deal with before the age of iPhones, where someone could immediately notify a large group of people to come
where you're at.
Swarm
Digital
you.
Stalking is a thing. I was talking to Capitol Police because obviously after this happened, and then I was elected to office, still working with the DOJ. There's security measures that are taken, and they were saying that actually specifically to female legislators especially, that there's a high element of this type of stalking that exists. But, to be clear, I always tell people, and I've always been a huge advocate for the Second Amendment, but I carry every single day. It doesn't matter where I'm at. I'm not the only one that carries. Most of my staff does. My husband does. And what I can also tell you is that, this individual, thank God, someone came forward and that they had information, but the local authorities did not take it seriously. This person ended up fleeing the country, and it was now under President Trump's administration 3 years after the fact that the person was finally brought to justice.
Folks, there's some real momentum in the fight for affordable health care. President Trump just signed a powerful executive order to drive down prescription drug prices across the board. But here's the thing. While the bureaucracy drags its feet, one pharmacy isn't waiting around. All Family Pharmacy is stepping up right now with real action to support the president's vision and give Americans more control over their health care. From now to the end of June, they're running a summer sale. You get 20% off site-wide, and here's what I love. You don't need insurance. They connect you right with licensed doctors in all 50 states, and they ship your prescriptions right to your door fast. Whether you're looking for ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, antibiotics, vitamins, emergency kits, travel kits, or just your daily meds, it's time to stock up now and save. If you believe in being prepared and you believe in medical freedom, this is your pharmacy. Head over to allfamilypharmacy.com/Matt. Use promo code MATT20 for 20% off your order. That's allfamilypharmacy.com/Matt. Code MATT20. Let's push back on Big Pharma and make America healthy again. So you get into Congress, one of one. Your national profile takes off. You do a ton of media. There are some people in Congress who resent that. I dealt with that all the time. Oh, you're always on TV.
You're just doing it for clicks.
Yeah, exactly. Clicks or hits or interviews or whatever. And, I would always really bristle at that criticism because I would have loved to have been able to win the battles that we were in the absence of a groundswell of populist support. I would love it if people in Congress weren't so utterly corrupt that you could sit there with logic and reason and persuasion and get them to the right side. But at the end of the day, you only move this town with force. And that force has to be generated by the people. And so, when you get some of those snide looks and sneers like I got, how do you think about your role in the Republican Party as one of our most prominent communicators?
I don't give a shit.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, I am. Actually, you were here with the whole inherent contempt vote on Garland, so a lot of people did not know that Congress had this, I call it this like ancient magic authority to basically go after people if they, for example, ignored subpoenas. At the time, it was under, the Biden DOJ. Garland defied Congress, protected the Hur tapes. As we know now, the Hur tapes have been released, and they did show that Biden was cognitively in decline, obviously suffering with memory issues. But the whole point is that I remember a member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress that's still there, actually told me that I was just doing it for attention and that it wasn't within my constitutional rights or authorities, and that's simply not true. It was. I also remember the former House counsel, who's since resigned as of a few weeks ago, actually told me that it was unconstitutional what I was trying to do. Come to find out that she was basically a rhino shill and was trying to actually protect Garland. And so what I will tell you is you cannot be here to make friends with these people because of the fact that a majority of people only care about one thing, and that's getting reelected. I can tell you, Matt, that I live in a very beautiful state. I have a very happy marriage, and I have an awesome little boy. And so if I, at the end of the day, don't get elected because I did what I generally think is right, I think that I'll sleep okay at night. And so that's really, I guess, what allows me to continue doing what I'm doing.
Well, you're not going anywhere yet, and you break through some of the culture walls that typically constrain nerdy politicians. Maxim did this big piece on you. I think Maxim wants you to run for president one day.
They actually asked me, that's
They would
funny.
love to have a former Maxim model as the president of the United States. But there was a theory of like republicanism when I was coming up through the movement, where there was this real embrace of modesty, right? And we were kind of the party that didn't want folks to say dirty words or things that made us feel uncomfortable. And it was the other side that was doing revealing photo shoots. And I think now we have like embraced our inner cool a little bit better. And that has a ton to do with Trump. But how do you think about the intersection of politics and culture and aesthetic and how it plays out with your public service and your image?
Well, so when I ran, and then also too during my first term, I actually didn't really tell people that I did Maxim or Sports Illustrated because I just, I didn't think that was something that I wanted to really lead with, mainly because I looked at it kind of just as a job and it was really in my past. But it was actually...
I don't know a single woman who, if they had the opportunity to go do Maxim or Sports Illustrated, wouldn't. Maybe I'm hanging out with the wrong crowd. But I think that most women, particularly millennials, view it as a celebration of beauty and self-determination.
Well, also, too, it happened... I was actually featured when I was in the military. So the Pentagon Air Force actually approved it because they said that it would help with recruitment numbers. So at
that
the time,
that was back in 2009. You would have had to have some male equipment in a bikini to get approved during the Biden years.
Well, so that's the context of like actually when it took place. And so when I actually ran, I didn't really like lead with that because I had so much in my bio, right? Like I was on track to go to medical school. I had just gotten out of the military. I actually, instead of going to medical school, I actually joined Turning Point USA. So I was a national grassroots activist. So that's kind of like really what I really had more like identified with and lead into. But it was actually a Democrat oppo firm that tried to leak my Maxim photos as if to hit me. And I said, yeah, I can biologically, because they're at the time like not able to define a woman. So I remember the tweet, I said, at least I can define a woman.
Oh, I was roaring in laughter with you on the House floors. I thought, wait a second, what the left believed would hurt Anna would be like a release of bathing suit pics.
Yeah, and by the way, my district is right on the water. Clearwater just got #2 beach in Florida. Like my constituents, a lot of them go on boats and we wear swimsuits.
Yeah, you don't represent Idaho.
Exactly.
It would have been a different thing in a different part of the country.
I told people, I was like, look, these are older photos, but like, yeah, I wear swimsuits actually on a regular basis. In fact, I wear bikinis and it's not a big deal. And what I will tell you is that it actually really, really badly blew up in their face because that's actually how I landed the cover of Maxim magazine. So
there you go.
Yeah.
You are in a lot of fights going on right now in Congress. And like when I would wake up, my favorite thing about the job was there were so many virtuous fights to be in any given day, probably more than any one member of Congress could lend their effort to. And so I was wondering if you would let my viewers in on like when you're evaluating the things that are before you in a day. You've got this JFK assassination project you're working on UAP disclosure, you're one of the most prominent members of the oversight committee. How do you design where to deploy your effort and how do you triage those fights that a day presents?
I am a chronic multitasker, and I actually learned that in the military from my job in the military, being able to manage an airfield, flight plans, inspections, flight logs, all of that. So that's actually how I conduct myself on a regular basis here in Washington. A lot of people say, well, how do you sleep? I mean, I sleep, but I think if you're doing what you genuinely are passionate about, it doesn't become work. And so I always make sure that I take time for myself and my family, but I'm very much so involved mentally in what I'm doing. And so, things go to slow right in Washington. And so you see that we've been conducting our investigations into JFK, but I'm simultaneously conducting that with like RFK, UAP stuff, the task force, obviously AutoPen with oversight.
Yeah, it
I'm
seems
also
like transparency
affairs.
is like the core central thesis of the
Of
things
all this.
that like. What about your psyche is so deeply offended when someone's trying to keep a secret from you?
I think what it is that it's so wrong. Like you actually had one of the youngest, most charismatic, arguable presidents in U.S. history that was just assassinated before the entire country. And then the gall of the federal government to just gaslight people and say, yeah, it was a single shooter, that was it. When I first announced that I was going to be on that task force, there was this like weird op against me saying that I was somehow going to like hold all declassification authority and hide it from the American people. And then as soon as Trump blew the doors off of it with just the immediate release, those people just crawled back under their rocks like the cockroaches that they were. But the point is that I think right now what we're seeing is this is only possible, the level of transparency with this administration, because you have people like Gabbard, like the CIA director, like Kash Patel that are actually ahead of these departments that also hold the same position and ideology that Trump does and that we do, and that the American people deserve transparency. For example, just yesterday we had a drop from the CIA that was directed by Ratcliffe that actually released for the first time in U.S. history the 44 pages of previously hidden 44 documents of the Joe Needes files. Joe Needes was one of the operatives that a lot of people say was responsible for potentially orchestrating the assassination on JFK, right? This has been kind of the biggest question in the JFK community for a very long time. And so we actually were able to obtain those files. Those are obviously going to be public record. I showed the investigators that we are working with, but the point is that would have only happened if President Trump and Ratcliffe had aligned and actually released that. Now, it's not everything yet. We're still working, and the CIA has actually called me to tell me that they're still working on releases, and those will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. But it's interesting, right? And I'm a history buff, and so I'm all about setting the historical precedent. So the Warren Commission can take a hike. We will have the final say on what happened with JFK and put together a report for the American people.
and I don't want you to prejudge that. I will just offer my own perspective. That I believe that elements of our own government were not only aware that this was going on, but were providing some sort of logistical support. Like the Saudis were providing logistical support for the 9/11 hijackers. I actually think our government. I think that's an interesting corollary where it might not have been a U.S. government person who set the exact route, but provided sufficient an ecosystem where that assassination could take place, which is a terrible thing to have to.
Well, look, we had
confront.
we had a doctor that was actually at the room where JFK was brought right after the shooting, that testified that JFK was shot from the front and the back. And so, I mean, this was an actual doctor who was a surgeon at the time. And when I actually went and made that statement, people said that I was a conspiracy theorist, that I was trying to summon dead people from the Warren Commission. I actually had people that were there actually in the room with Kennedy as it took place. And so the media will try to dispel that. But what I will tell you is that, when you have the CIA, the former CIA, actively working to undermine the American people's judgment on JFK, hiding information, lying to Congress, destroying evidence, I think that tells you everything you need to know about the CIA at the time. And so you, as well as 60% plus of other Americans, also have that same sentiment. So we're just simply providing them the answers for them to conclude their own conclusions.
Do you trust John Ratcliffe, the
I
CIA
like him,
director?
yeah, I actually trust him. And in fact, everything that we've asked for so far, he's delivered on. So I actually really like him.
Nice, terrific. Vish is so bummed he's not able to participate in this podcast. He's back in San Diego. But the one thing he said I had to ask you about, you have been chiming in on this rapper trial going on
Tory
right
Lanez.
now. Yeah, so who is that?
Yeah.
And what is going on?
Yeah, Tory Lanez is a well-known rapper who was accused of shooting Megan Thee Stallion, who's also a rapper.
I've heard of her.
Yeah, Megan Thee Stallion was the one that was dancing for Kamala Harris at her rally, which is interesting because we all know Kamala Harris was now paying people for these endorsements. But that's
I know.
a separate conversation.
We were doing it for Trump for free. We were just doing it because we loved the man. And these people have way more money than us. We're getting bank. We are the dopes.
Exactly. But, what's interesting is, so Megan Thee Stallion said that Tory Lanez shot her in the foot. You get shot in the foot, it looks a little bit different. Come to find out that the DNA evidence didn't match the firearm for Tory, that obviously there was no shrapnel that was able to be located, that the information and statements made by Megan Thee Stallion conflicted with body cam footage from officers and statements and affidavits as well. And so I do believe that Tory Lanez was unfairly put on trial and that he's being incarcerated with faulty evidence. And so there's actually been a big push to get Gavin Newsom to review and pardon him. And I would also tell anyone that you can actually find that information at 36hourslater.com if you want to see the full information on Tory Lanez.
Newsom's trying to do everything else Trump's doing. Hanging out with Charlie Kirk. Why not pardon a black rapper?
I mean, I think that this obviously is a huge swing and miss for Democrats if they don't get on board with this because, they typically tend to try to say that they, own the black vote. I would argue that they don't. You're seeing that actually being reflected with the support of President Trump, not just from black Americans, but also from Hispanic Americans. But the fact that right now they're being so quiet on this, I think speaks to the fact that, there's this very real fear that if you call to question someone like Megan Thee Stallion that you'll get hit by cancel culture and saying that you're not defending women, when in actuality it seems that Megan Thee Stallion is probably suffering from a drinking affliction and that she made faulty statements and that as a result of that someone is unfairly being incarcerated right now.
Yeah, I don't know about her afflictions, but people of all genders can lie, right?
All genders, shapes, and sizes can lie, and unfortunately, you're seeing right now that Tory Lanez he was stabbed 14 times in jail, actually just a few weeks ago. It's a miracle that he's alive right now.
Wow.
And so this definitely goes pretty deep, but I think that he'll get pardoned. I know Snoop Dogg's been very vocal for him, Drake, a couple of other people within the music industry who, by the way, I don't have any connection to, and by the way, I'm not like a rapper, but I do know how to read, and I do know good evidence and bad evidence when I see it, and he was basically given a sham trial.
So if one pillar of the Luna representation is this real vein for transparency and justice, I would say the other, in my observation, is your recalcitrance to these spending levels. You do seem genuinely aggrieved by how much money the federal government is spending. It is the source of everybody's discord and disagreement right now. I was struck by what Rand Paul said, that if he didn't vote against this bill, he was worried there'd be nobody left in Washington that cared about spending. Help my viewers understand how difficult it is for the 10, 20 of you who still care about this to try to get the rest to prioritize the courage it takes to reduce spending?
Yeah, so you'll have an example to where it is about 20 plus members maybe that actually care about stopping the bleed in spending. But what ends up happening is, remember, we only have one vote. And so you have a majority of the Republican Party and really the Democrat Party that will message that if you are being responsible with funding, that you are essentially, today Chuck Schumer said that people were going to die, that we were all going to die if, President Trump's big, beautiful bill went through. What I would say is that there's also a lot of parliamentary procedure in the way that the sausage is made that people don't fully understand. So remember, we have to be able to negotiate on our own terms. So when we send something over to Senate, we understand that it's maybe not a final product. And then, so for example, in this big, beautiful bill what went through in reconciliation, the Senate then has to send us a version back. And then we have to see if we agree to that. And so what I will tell people is obviously, Rand Paul is not the only person that cares about spending in Washington, but it is very hard to actually get these people to want to, and I don't like using the word cut, I like using the word save, because what these people end up doing is thinking, okay, whoever they're donating or getting donations from are not going to redonate to them. They might not get reelected, etc. And they don't really have, I think, sometimes the backbone to be able to get combative in some of these arguments, even if it's against people like ourselves. And so it can be frustrating at times, but at least when you are going, and honestly, thank God we have X right now, because that's helping to, I think, combat a lot of the, typically how it would be done is they would plant stories against you saying that you're, voting to cut. For example, this is what the left did, saying that we were responsible for cutting all USAID funding that went to some of the AIDS medicines, and that's simply not the case. That was kickstarted back on again, but the fact is we have a massive spending problem and we have to reel it in. So we have to go back to pre-COVID levels of spending, and I would argue even probably farther.
You are also a real advocate for this MAHA movement.
Oh, hell yeah.
You're a MAHA mom. Mm-hmm. I think this is a massive threat to the Democratic Party because
I was MAHA before it was cool.
They basically said they didn't really want alpha men in their party, and really any men. I mean, other than the betas and the transsexuals. And now they're losing a lot of the moms. And what are you hearing from moms? And am I overly optimistic that this MAHA branding is bringing a lot of women to the Republican Party?
I'm in solidarity with the Granola Moms. And so what I will tell you is that, again, I've been following this since before it was really, I think, top of the campaign trail issue for this past election cycle. Obviously, especially being a new mom, what my aha moment is that I was actually sitting and interviewing someone from the FDA on infant formula. I don't know if you remember, Matt, but the infant formula crisis where Biden actually pulled all the formula off because there was contaminants. Well, I was looking into that. And you have really only one or two manufacturers for all the infant formula in all of the United States. And there was an outbreak during COVID. They weren't inspecting the facilities. They then sold this product, didn't report it, didn't recall it. And a majority, I think it was like maybe 10%, 20% of infants exposed to it would have then suffered fatality. So we have no idea how many infants actually died as a result of this. But then the Biden administration then took some of the contaminated formula and they actually sent it to the border. And
wow.
So you have, obviously I'm a border hawk, but I don't also believe that migrant children should be given.
Yeah,
I don't believe that they should be given
I was also formula. A fan of European settlement. I didn't think that the idea of giving the monkeypox
not good.
Blankets to the
not
Indians
good. And so what I will tell you is after that happened, I obviously did not trust the FDA. Then we looked into what happened with the whole thalidomide issue. And so it really caused me to look into these other things that were being put into a lot of big food. And what I would say is big food is worried about how much money they're going to make at the end of the quarter. So they go for the cheapest product. And a lot of time the cheapest product and additives are not good for you. And so you can look at plenty of things, how they are manufactured here versus in other states. But what's interesting is there was not a lot of appetite for codification of this until RFK came on board, and then people realized, oh, well, there's some voter support for it. But really, we're only seeing the charge on this being led out of the White House because there's still fatigue in Congress to actually do it. And I was also talking about, high fructose corn syrup. A lot of people didn't want to talk about that either. And then also too, parabens. I actually went to another member in Florida to see if I could actually help get them to lead out this effort to remove parabens, which is toxic additives, to our personal hygiene products. And they said that they're too preoccupied with other stuff and that they couldn't help me on the issue. So, I'm still pushing this issue. I still care about it deeply. But what I will tell you is make sure that you are looking into your ingredients, because if you have a young kid, their entire endocrine system is being developed, your family, long-term exposures. I mean, we're talking about disease here. You need to make sure that you're very closely monitoring that, because don't trust big government and don't trust big food either.
4 years ago, no Republicans were talking like that. Like that monologue you just gave, you would expect to hear in the farthest left corners of Democratic discourse. But I'm so here for it, because for our country to be strong, we have to be strong as well. There are a lot of people who are going to watch this podcast who don't live in the St. Pete area. They're going to say, I really wish she was representing me, and throughout Florida, throughout the country. Do you rule anything out in terms of maybe one day seeking statewide office in Florida or national office?
I have not really thought about it, to be honest with you, because I feel like, you always get those questions, and it would be a discussion that I'd have to definitely have with Andy, my husband, because it's already a lot. As you know, I come up here and I fly up here with my son every single time we're in session. And it's a huge sacrifice, you know this of all people, for your family to actually have to be exposed and put in the political limelight. But, right now I'm here to support President Trump and his agenda, and I think anything else is a distraction from the future. I would, again, have to really seriously think about that.
Veteran, military spouse, Maxim model, assassination target, maverick congresswoman, and maybe future candidate for statewide or national office, Paulina Luna. Thank you so much for everything you do and for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
Want to see more great videos like this? Click on the link below to subscribe to OAN Live and watch Dan Ball's Real America and The Matt Gaetz Show on Dish Channel 212. Tune in, subscribe, and watch today.